Right now on Close Up, Republican presidential candidate Rand Paul brings his message of smaller government to central Iowa.
So you want more, it's where do you want the money? Do you want the money in the pool of the private sector, which is the productive sector, or do you want it in the non-productive sector, which is government?
Also, Paul's view on the proposed Bakken oil pipeline and the use of eminent domain right now on Close Up.
This is Iowa's news leader. This is KCCI 8 News Close Up.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us for KCCI 8 News Close Up. Kentucky Senator Rand Paul says the federal government is intrusive and needs to be reined in. Cynthia Fodor has more on the message he's delivering to Iowans.
This Republican presidential candidate is best known as the son of Ron Paul, who ran for president 3 times. Coming from a political family, Rand just rode the Tea Party wave into Washington 5 years ago as a Kentucky senator.
The number one issue in the country is the debt. We have to do something about the debt. The debt is all-consuming, and it threatens the very foundation of our republic, and that's why I'm running.
He's all for limited government, reducing federal spending and restricting defense spending.
Why do we keep spending money hand over fist that is wasted? Well, the reason we do is because people in Washington lack the courage to stop it.
The 52-year-old is also known as an advocate for civil liberties and privacy, an opponent of the Patriot Act, holding up phones in speeches saying it's none of the government's business what you do with your smartphone.
The students I meet are among the most passionate defenders of liberty everywhere. You get it. The government has no business peering through your records, combing through your emails, or monitoring your social media.
You've got to run somebody who is different. You've got to run somebody who says, you know what, not only are we the party of the Second Amendment, but we're going to be the party of the Fourth Amendment. We're going to be the party that respects your right to privacy.
Not just a politician, Paul is an eye surgeon with 3 sons. He coached their teams, is involved with his Presbyterian church and the Lions Club, providing free eye care for those in need. He was not named after author Ayn Rand, an icon for libertarians. His real first name is Randall, and his wife shortened his nickname to Rand from Randy. Cynthia Fodor, KCCI 8 News, Iowa's news leader.
On Friday, Paul stopped into our studios. We talked about the recent terror attacks on Paris and the divisive issue of accepting refugees from Syria.
Senator, thank you for joining us this evening. First of all, I want to get your response to some recent issues. You've been opposed to U.S. intervention in the Middle East before. Have the recent attacks in Paris changed your stance on that at all? If so, why not?
Well, I think ISIS has grown in some ways because of our intervention over there. When we toppled Gaddafi in Libya, it led to a failed state. So I've objected to Hillary's war in Libya, but I've also objected to Marco Rubio's support for the war in Libya as well, because I think that created chaos over there, and out of that chaos, now 1/3 of Libya pledges allegiance to ISIS. Same thing in the Syrian civil war. I warned against giving arms to the allies of ISIS and the allies of al-Qaeda. I said that wasn't a good idea, and sure enough, as those allies fought against Assad and pushed Assad back, there was a space, and in that space, ISIS grew stronger. So I think it's actually our intervention in the Middle East that's actually made us weaker and allowed some of these enemies of the U.S. to actually grow stronger.
How do we provide proper support to our allies when they're the ones being attacked?
Well, I think there's all kinds of ways to provide support for France, and I think ultimately the victory over there that's going to have to occur to stamp this aberrant form of Islam. Ultimately, civilized Islam, I think, is going to have to rise up and say, this doesn't represent our religion. ISIS is now surrounded by people on every side that despises what they're doing and saying about Islam. So I think ultimately there will be boots on the ground, that will be Arab boots on the ground. And frankly, I've said that we can support our allies there, such as the Kurds, who I think are good fighters, and I would send arms directly to them. But I think the boots on the ground need to be Arab boots on the ground.
You've been taking on Senate leadership from your own party. You mentioned Marco Rubio just moments ago on how to handle Syrians coming into the U.S. Ultimately, how would you like to see this very heated issue dealt with at this time?
Well, a couple years ago on the immigration bill, that Marco Rubio and Chuck Schumer did together, I introduced an amendment that would have said we need more scrutiny on people coming to visit us from the Middle East, people who are coming here as refugees. Why? Well, the Boston bombers were here on the refugee program. 2 Iraqi refugees came to my hometown in Bowling Green, turned out to want to buy Stinger missiles. So there have been people using the refugee program to attack us. So I introduced an amendment, but it was blocked by Marco Rubio. My amendment would have said we need more scrutiny. I'm trying to do the same thing this week, and I'm still fighting people on both sides of the aisle, but I think we need more scrutiny on those who would come to visit us, who might want to harm us.
Okay. Senator, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, he's down in the polls here in Iowa, but Rand Paul says he's got an ace in the hole. We'll tell you what that is next on Close Up. Now on Close Up, Republican presidential candidate Rand Paul brings his message of smaller government to central Iowa.
So you want more, it's where do you want the money? Do you want the money in the pool of the private sector, which is the productive sector, or do you want it in the non-productive sector, which is government?
Also, Paul's view on the proposed Bakken oil pipeline and the use of eminent domain right now on Close Up.
This is Iowa's news leader. This is KCCI 8 News Close Up.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us for KCCI 8 News Close Up. Welcome back to KCCI 8 News Close Up. Rand Paul continues to trail in the latest polls here in Iowa, but he says those same polls accurately gauge one group that he says accounts for a large part of his support. Recently, Des Moines Register columnist Kathy Obradovich and I talked with the Kentucky senator about that and a host of other issues. Good morning. Thank you for joining us for KCCI 8 News Close Up. Joining us this morning is Republican presidential candidate, Kentucky Senator Rand Paul. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
So we want to begin with the latest Iowa poll. You're polling at 5% in that poll. Ben Carson currently leading with 28%, Donald Trump 19%. What message do you think the voters are sending here that the top 2 vote getters, support getters here, are not political?
I think one of the interesting things is so far we're doing polls of people who are undecided. So in that poll, if you ask people, have you decided who you're voting for, about 2/3 will say they haven't decided. So this is really sort of a poll of which way you're leaning if you're undecided, and isn't really an accurate representation yet. We also think that young people aren't as well sampled. If you look how many young people are involved in the polls, we're spending a lot of time when we think one of our best constituencies are college kids. We think they're undersampled. We also think we do very well with independents. We think they're undersampled as well. So we think we're actually doing better than what the polls represent, but we still want to do better. We plan on winning, and we're going door to door, we're mailing, we're calling, we're doing everything we can to see if we can win in Iowa, because we think it's really important to win here.
College students are enthusiastic, but a lot of times the follow-through is difficult. It's a heavier lift to get them to turn out at the caucuses. How do you go about that with your organization?
You may have to pick them up, you may have to wake them up, and then you may have to pick them up.
You're going to do that personally?
It may take that. But some of it is better for us this time than in the past. There are 120,000 kids that go to college in Iowa. That's a lot. That's actually equal to the number of people that actually turn out in the Iowa caucus. And so this time they're actually in school. Right. They haven't been in school. Because, you know, we kept creeping forward with the caucus into January. Now it's going to be February 1st. They'll all be in college. So we're working every college. We're organized on 20 college campuses. I was here 2 weeks ago, and I think we did 9 of the college campuses in a 2-day period. So we have enthusiastic support on college campuses, I think mainly because I don't want the government looking at all their phone records. I want the government leaving them alone. I'm not big on the government putting people in jail for minor drug offenses. I'm not an advocate, but I do think that kids deserve a second chance if they make mistakes with drugs. And then thirdly, I'm not a big person who's excited about sending young people to another war in the Middle East. I think the first war in Iraq was a mistake, and I'm not inclined to send the kids back to another war.
You're simultaneously on the ballot for Senate for re-election to the Senate in Kentucky. And sometimes Republicans say to me that they're not sure that you're all in with the presidential campaign because of that. Why are you running simultaneously for re-election?
Many people have done it. It's not that unusual. You know, Paul Ryan last time ran as the vice presidential nominee and for Congress simultaneously, and I don't think I remember even a story being written about it, so it's not that uncommon. LBJ did it back in the 60s. I think Lieberman did it recently. John Kerry has done it. So it just depends on the cycle. If you're in cycle, some people will run for both. But we are working very hard. We're here to win. We're not messing around. We're not here to play games. We are here to win Iowa, and we've worked very hard in Iowa, and I think we have the best ground game of any campaign out there. Now, I might be a little bit biased, but we do have a strong ground game, and we are out there everywhere. In fact, it was funny. I saw Senator Grassley back in the Senate one day, and he said, "Yeah, I live down a long barren road, and look at what they put on my door." And so somebody from our team had been to his door
and leafleted Senator Grassley.
And leafleted him somewhere out in the middle of wherever. I think he lives in a fairly remote area, but they had gotten all the way to his door and left a leaflet. And I think I'm impressed that we had a good ground game like that.
Coming up, how Rand Paul says we can cut our military spending and still be safe. We'll be right back. When it comes to government waste and overspending, Rand Paul says Democrats are only part of the problem. Here's why.
News breaking that the U.S. now has boots on the ground in Syria. Is that a mistake? You've been wanting to disentangle the United States military around the world. How bad is it, and how do you manage that if you become president?
Well, the Constitution gives very clear instructions about how we go to war. The way we're supposed to go to war is initiated by Congress. So the president doesn't really have the power to do this. He's doing this illegally. We've been illegally at war in the Middle East for the last year. Now, he will say, oh, we voted on it right after 9/11. We voted on going after terrorists. But the 9/11 authorization for war said that we were going after the people who attacked us on 9/11. And we did, and we got most of those people. This war in Iraq has nothing to do with 9/11, so we should have to vote again. One generation should not bind the next generation to war. So
how would you vote?
If we obeyed the Constitution, we would have a debate, the evidence would be presented, we would vote. I would vote not to go back to war in Iraq, because I think the first war in Iraq made us less safe. It made the region more chaotic. It's actually allowed Iran to have a greater influence. Iran is now emboldened. Iran has troops in Russia. Troops in Iraq, and now you have Russia coming in. We spent $1 trillion, lost nearly 5,000 U.S. soldiers, our sons and daughters, and then when Iraq had to make a choice, they chose Russia over us. So no, I don't want to send our young men and women back in there, and I'm not for sacrificing any more of our daughters over there.
Given the hot spots and trouble spots around the world, can the U.S. actually afford to decrease military spending? A lot of your opponents or colleagues in the Republican Party are saying no. Increase military spending.
I think if you're a fiscal conservative, meaning that you think borrowing money and having an $18 trillion debt is bad, the only way you can be a fiscal conservative is if you believe that we should conserve money everywhere, military as well as domestic spending. So the right wants more money for military, the left wants more money for domestic spending. They get together, and I say they have a secret handshake, and they spend more money. I don't think we're stronger if we're farther in debt. In fact, I don't think you project power from bankruptcy court. I think we're actually weakening the country by doing this. If you want to know, do we spend enough on the military? We spend more than the next 10 countries combined, and we've had a 50% increase in spending on the military since 9/11. So I think we spend quite a bit. This week in Congress, the Defense Committee, the Armed Services Committee, came out and said we had one program that cost us $20 billion in waste in the military alone. Why don't we start cutting some of the waste if we need more money for our soldiers?
Coming up, Paul's take on eminent domain and the proposed Bakken oil pipeline.
One of the issues that you may be against some other Republicans on is the Bakken oil pipeline, which is a natural gas pipeline that go through Iowa. One of the issues that is controversial is how are they going to get that land to cross Iowa farmland. A lot of times people use it through eminent domain. You know, you've criticized Donald Trump for using eminent domain for his casinos. What is your take on the Bakken
I'm consistent. I'm against any private property owner having their property taken through eminent domain and given to another private property owner. I think that's a misuse of eminent domain. Eminent domain should be something very very rare for roads or utilities or something, but not for private entities. And
Well, at what point,
I would
though,
have them negotiate a fair price, negotiate a fair market price, but no farmer in Iowa should have their land taken through eminent domain for this pipeline.
At what point, though, should a few holdouts be able to stop something that might, in fact, have tremendous public value, in jobs value?
Yeah, but here's an example, and they've used this sort of relative value. Let's say you have a church and they don't pay any taxes, and I say, well, I've got a big department store, I'll pay there and I'll pay a lot of taxes if you'll just get the church out of the way. These property rights, or are they so relative that we would wipe out a church to put a retail store? They've actually tried that. That's where we're headed if we let eminent domain carry off. I think your private property is yours. I would never let them take a church, but I'd also never let them take your house. Let them negotiate a fair market price. The original railroad that went across the northern part of the U.S., all was done through fair negotiations without eminent domain.
Can we talk about your jobs plan?
Yeah. The way we create jobs is we have to understand where jobs are created, and I think jobs are created by the private marketplace, not government. So what I would do is leave an enormous amount of money in the private marketplace. I tell people it's as simple as this. The more money you leave in Iowa, the more jobs you'll create in Iowa. What does that mean? You've got to have lower taxes. So, my tax plan that would have one single rate, 14.5%, you could fill it out on one postcard. That'd be a significant for most Americans. In fact, every American at every socioeconomic level would get a tax cut under my plan. And people said, well, the government would have enough money. Well, precisely. That's my goal, is to starve government. I want government to be, as I said in the debate, so small you can barely see it. The federal government was never intended by the Constitution or our founders to be big. It was intended to be small, and it was intended to have a balanced budget every year. And things that weren't specifically delegated and given to Congress were to be left to the states and the people. Most governments should be local, where you can go down the street, and if you don't like something, knock on your neighbor's door and say, Mr. City Councilman or Miss City Councilman, I want this different. But it shouldn't be some distant person that's hard to get in touch with. So most responsibility, I think, should be state and local, and we should have a very small federal government that basically defends us. National defense, judiciary, and a few other items.
But how do you create the jobs? What's the motivation?
Jobs are created by entrepreneurs having more money, and so what we have to do is leave more money in their hands. So let's say you're an entrepreneur and you want to start a business in Des Moines. Well, let's say right now you pay 39% in taxes. Well, if I make your taxes 14.5%, you're going to have a lot more money. If you already have a business, maybe you expand the business and hire more people. Those are jobs. Let's say you're wanting to get started and you just can't afford that tax rate. Right now, people are deciding whether to do their business here or move it to Canada or move it overseas, because our tax rates, we have the highest business tax in the world, 35%. And then personal taxes are in the 39, 42, 44% range. And I think if you make those lower, people have more money. You also need to cut regulations, because regulations stifle jobs as well.
Sometimes we talk about the new normal, though, in our economy, where if you give more tax breaks and maybe let businesses save more on regulation, they're not creating more jobs. They're just giving more money back to the shareholders and investors.
And then where does that money go, though? I mean, that money goes into a bank, and a new entrepreneur borrows that from a bank. So you want more. It's where do you want the money? Do you want the money in the pool of the private sector, which is the productive sector, or do you want it in the non-productive sector, which is government? Government should be small, because government doesn't do anything very well. And Milton Friedman put it this way. He said nobody spends somebody else's money as wisely as their own. So government will always be inefficient. That's why you should keep it small. We need to leave more money in the hands of those who earn it, entrepreneurs, and then you'll have more jobs. If I say, well, I don't want a job, but I want to buy a boat, let's say I'm doing really well in my business, I want to buy a speedboat. Still creates a job. Somebody has to make the speedboat. Let's say I decide I don't want anything. I'm just going to stick it in a bank. Somebody else borrows it and they pay me interest. But it stays in the productive marketplace. If you send it to Washington, it gets gobbled up by non-productive things. Bureaucrats don't make anything other than headaches for business people. So you want more money to be left in Iowa and send less money to Washington.
You're a doctor. Would you like to go back to the days when people actually wrote you personally a check for their health care instead of going through all the insurance companies, et cetera. And is it possible that America ever gets back to that point?
The advantages of a patient writing a check directly is, one, you get rid of the middleman, but it also reduces prices. So there are two things in my practice as an eye surgeon that the patient did write a check directly. LASIK surgery to get rid of the glasses, no insurance covers it. But here's an interesting side effect. The price came down every year for 15 years because the average patient would call 4 doctors and they always ask the price. If you have to have your gallbladder out, try calling a hospital and getting a price. You can't get it. But if you want LASIK surgery, I guarantee you can call 4, 5, 10 different doctors in Des Moines. They'll all give you a price, and they'll woo you, and they'll negotiate based on price. Same thing with contact lenses, much cheaper. But my price for contact lenses was about the same as Walmart because I had to. I had to compete. Nobody was get them for 10 times what Walmart is. I had to be within pennies of Walmart. So competition works, but that's competition where we got rid of the middleman. You get rid of the insurance company. It may not be possible to go to that system, but if everybody did, let's say everybody had a high deductible, you'd have a very low premium. Premiums are horrendous. People are paying $15,000, $20,000 for their family. You could do it for $1,000, $2,000 if you had a high deductible and you paid everything. But think of all those savings, and if you did it from birth and had a health savings account, kids would build up bigger and bigger accounts. Insurance makes money because we primarily don't get sick. That's the secret of this. 98 to 99% of us aren't very sick and aren't spending much. Do you need insurance? Yes. You want insurance against getting cancer, car accident, something terrible happening to you, getting a bad disease that's chronic. So you want insurance. But for day-to-day expenses, if we actually paid directly, things would be cheaper, and you'd have a lot more of your take-home pay.
And one last question for you. Your thoughts on Paul Ryan as Speaker of the House?
I'm not sure it'll be any different. You know, I was disappointed that he went along with raising the debt ceiling and also increasing the spending. But I guess I wasn't too surprised. In 2013, he led the effort to raise spending back then, too. Some have hopes. I don't deal directly with the day-to-day business in the House, but I'm afraid that we're going to get some more of the same, which is more spending and more debt. And the reason I think voters are very frustrated is, particularly Republican voters, we have a Republican House, we have a Republican Senate, and we don't seem to have a lot to show for it because the people who have been up there a long time, they tend to just sort of go along with the flow and they just keep spending money. And I find Republicans, you talked earlier about Republicans voting for outsiders, yeah, because they're really, really unhappy with Washington continuing really to add to the debt and add to the burden.
All right. Thanks, Senator. We
Thank
really
you.
appreciate you taking the time today.